getting somebody's name right is a basic respect thing, right? I mean, if you've ever been like on a call where somebody keeps using the wrong name for you, you know how infuriating that can be and how quickly it can just get under your skin. And that goes triple or quadruple for LGBTQ folks because oftentimes we're getting misgendered 10 to 20 times a day, right? And so I do hear and I understand, especially folks who maybe this is new for them. I mean, it's a habit like anything else, right? Like if you start brushing your teeth with a different hand than you normally use, it's going to be frustrating for the first couple weeks that you do it. And these are linguistic habits. They're things that we've done over and over and over again, and so it's going to take a little practice to do something else. Um, but I do hear folks that are saying things like, "Oh, it's just so frustrating. Like I screw up once and they just explode at me or whatever." It's not just that you screwed up once, right? It's that you're like the 25th person to do it that day. And they're just like overwhelmed and sick of it at the end of the day. As somebody who personally uses they and them pronouns, it is very frustrating to just get misgendered 20 to 25 five times a day if you're going out in public all the time. It feels like it's fairly isolating, and it feels like your identity is um, coming across as something that it's not, which obviously it is. Otherwise, those people wouldn't be doing that. So it's just a very disorienting experience if you've never had it happen to you. Obviously, it's hard to kind of communicate how that feels, and I understand that again, it can be hard to even wrap your head around at some level if you've never had that experience. But just imagine that, like, whenever you go out in public, people are calling you the wrong name every single time, and you can't figure out why. And you've told them repeatedly that that's not your name, and they just keep doing it. Like it would just be so confusing and frustrating, right? Like just try to imagine it happening to you, and you can maybe start to get a grasp of what happens to these kids kind of every single day in a lot of interactions that they're having. And yes, I can understand that that would not be a fun place to be when you're the person that gets blown up at for doing it once. But I think you also have to extend some empathy to them and say, they're not really just mad at you. They're mad at the situation that they're in, and you're just the straw that kind of broke the camel's back in that particular situation. So yes, it's extremely important to get people's names right. I think that one's maybe a little bit more obvious. It is also very important to get people's pronouns right, though, too, because oftentimes when you're talking about somebody, you're using their pronouns more than you're using their name. If I'm talking about Nick, I'm going to say, like Nick went to the store, he got some groceries. Those groceries are his groceries. Like I've already used your pronouns twice, and I've only used your name once. So it does become kind of important to get those things right. And I understand it can be frustrating, and I understand it can be confusing. But just try to think of it from the other end. Try to think of like this is how you're trying to represent yourself, and other people just aren't getting it, and they aren't getting it in some of the most fundamental ways, because they're talking about you, and they're not talking about you in the way that you would talk about you. That's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I've always kind of just erred on the side of humility and understanding,
Yeah.
like I'm just gonna just fess up. Okay, sorry about that. Like I'm gonna do better next time, but then work to actually do better.
Right. Yeah, sometimes it takes practice. Sometimes you have to sit down and just, like, say it a few times. Again, just to build that habit, because some of this is even I it's not technically muscle memory, but it feels a lot like muscle memory. Like, I know you played guitar, before. I played, a lot of guitar, and, there's just certain things that you can't do until you've done them 20 times in a row. It just doesn't click with your hand. Your hand just won't do it. But then that 21st time, your hand just does it, and you don't even have to think about it. And that's what we're talking about here, is just building up that kind of familiarity with that, so that eventually you don't even have to think about it. It just happens.
And I think maybe I could add for the benefit of listeners too, like I think a pretty common practice for teachers at the beginning of a semester, at the beginning of a year is roll call.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine, right? I already get stressed about that. Like as a person on the receiving end of that, like you're just waiting to hear your name, you're waiting to say here, etc. But then for a student that doesn't go by that name on that roster, the first conversation, the first interaction they have to have is that like, hey, I go by this. right? Or risk, like outing themselves to their classmates, and then they become the center of attention there too. And that was a lesson that I had to learn, the hard way several years ago. And I know then my practice has changed where on day one, I don't do the big roll call anymore. I let kids sit where they're going to sit for that first day. And I literally just go around with my clipboard and I have students introduce themselves.
Yeah, that's a good
And
idea.
so I just sit with them at the table. It takes, a minute per table. I'm like, hey, good to meet you. Who are you? I'm Mr. Covington. And they just say their name.
Yeah.
So if it's different than what it is in the roster, I'm like, hey, nice to meet you, so and so. And then I write down that name, ask them about any spellings, and then I'm moving on to the next thing. So that way it's not an issue. They get to introduce themselves as
Yeah.
right they perceive themselves, and there's an issue, there's a comfort and a relationship building thing that begin from day one on that. And then to your comment about using your other hand for the toothbrush there, then when I see, because I'll use the name that they refer to themselves, and that's who they are. And then when I go say like enter grades on Infinite Campus or whatever, I'll see a name in there that I have never once
Right, right,
referred to
right.
the student as, and I have to sit and think, okay, who is this person? Oh yeah, that's so and so. Okay, so then I go through that way. But I will say, like, it's been absolutely incredible to see too just how responsive and kind and like humane high schoolers are about these things today. Like I have
Sure.
transgender students who they are who they are to their classmates, and like that was not an experience that I had growing up
Yeah.
in Iowa in the 90s and the early
Me
2000s.
neither.
And
Me neither.
yeah, I don't know where this comes from, but
Same.
kids are just tolerant and accepting as hell. And I love to see it. It's the adults in the buildings who have the catching up to do oftentimes.